think a lot of you guys have already seen the show and worked with the show somewhat in some of your classes, but we're really happy to be hosting the show here and borrowing all of these posters from the collection from the Center for Southwest Research at the University of New Mexico Library System. And we're really fortunate to have Suzanne Schadl here today, who is a librarian and a professor within the University of New Mexico, and she is very familiar with this collection, has worked to put it together and archive it and research it within the university, and so we're really lucky to have her here to tell us a little bit more about the collection and the historical and political context from which it arises. So please join me in welcoming Suzanne.
You said that was going to be informal. It felt sort of formal to me. Can you guys hear me? Yes. Can everybody hear me? Yes. Okay. So I'm really excited to be here. This is my first trip to Portland and Vancouver. This is a great opportunity for me to see your cities, but also to see these materials that we hold in map cases in the basement of our main library on walls, because when something goes up on a wall and when it's put next to something else, it starts to converse with the pieces in a way that doesn't happen when you're looking at a digital object on a computer screen or when you're looking at a single physical object in a pile on a map case. So it's really a great opportunity to see these pieces sort of across the room from one another, talking to one another, and talking to so many individuals. What a great turnout. What a great opportunity for some of our Latin American collections to be really in your faces. So in the sort of spirit of conversation, what I'd like to say about myself as an instructor and also as a librarian working with area studies collections is I do think that it's really important that conversations around material, around ideas, around creativity, around scholarship are very important. So I really want to invite you all to converse with me today. I've written down a couple of things that will sort of help give context to these pieces, but I'm really curious about what you see in the pieces, okay? Because I think we probably all come at these materials with very different perspectives, okay? So please feel free to jump in and interrupt me and ask me questions, or tell me what you see as we sort of move around the room in order to talk about materials. So dealing with conversations, these opportunities are great for me, not just because I get to talk to people who maybe haven't seen these materials before, haven't thought about Latin America in the context of graphic design or in the context of the arts, but I also get to meet people who know firsthand about these materials. I have never been to an exhibition where somebody at that gallery doesn't have some experience with the pieces or with the people who created the pieces on the wall. So I have to note that in the room here today, you have an artist that's represented in this exhibition, and an aficionado who is responsible for some of the pieces that are hanging on the wall, and that's Alan Oliver, who I'll point out his piece, but he had a gallery in Portland called Onda. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it. But that gallery actually provided some of the pieces that are here today. So there are always connections that we don't know about, that we learn about when we see something in a new place. So please share what you have, because I learn from you, and hopefully you can learn a little something from me and from Alan and whomever else. Okay? Are we good? All right. So I want to make, in addition to that invitation, another invitation. What you see here is a selection of materials from 3 different collections at the University of New Mexico, and all 3 of those collections have selections that are available online. So I do want to invite you, if you are intrigued or curious or excited or angered by any of these images, I want to invite you to sort of go a little deeper into those collections. So usually if I were giving a library talk, I would be able to pull things up on the screen and show them to you, but you have it, it's better here. But what I do want to say is, please, you know, I'm a librarian, I'm going to tell you use Google, all right? So if you are interested in any of these pieces, I'm going to give you some artist names. You can always Google those artists. but I want to sort of put some collections in your heads, okay? So think of Googling UNM Lenora Davis, right? And you are going to get several materials that deal with Cuba and Nicaragua, right? And also Vietnam, okay? And Mexico. You can also Google UNM Sam Slick. That's an easy one to remember. Sam is easy to spell, and Slick is just like it sounds out there on your sidewalks, okay? That's an interesting collection, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. It's an enormous collection of materials, about 12,000 posters. 5,000 or 6,000 are available in that online format, and they cover the gamut of Latin America and Iberia. But those that are digitized are Cuba, Mexico, El Salvador, Nicaragua, what am I forgetting? Panama, Bolivia, Brazil. Did I say Cuba first? Okay. So you'll get a nice sampling there. And then the third one, which is more contemporary, so it's my job to take what was already at UNM when I started there and to build on it. So you can see here, if you're thinking this is from 3 different collections, that we have an emphasis on the graphic arts from Latin America. And our newest collection is from an artist collective in Oaxaca, Mexico, called the Asamblea de Artistas Revolucionarios de Oaxaca, or ASARO, A-S-A-R-O. So if you look at UNM ASARO collection, you're going to find a lot of materials there as well. Okay, so please investigate farther. You can also contact me. I have cards on there. So those are my invitations. I would like to, if you guys have ideas or reactions, I'd love to hear those before I start talking about artists and contexts and so forth. I don't want to lose anybody who's got something burning in their head.
These are all kind of precious, but I'm assuming that they were made in mass quantities sort of based all over the place. Is that correct?
I think that's an excellent question, and my answer is going to be tentative, because in some cases that's absolutely true, and in other cases it's quite the opposite. So a lot of the materials that are here from Cuba were actually funded as arts by the government, and they tend to come in fairly limited runs, ranging from like 200 prints to maybe 1,000 prints. A lot of the materials in the Slick collection are exactly what you're talking about. They're incredibly ephemeral election materials that are put out in mass. They were designed to disappear probably as quickly as they appeared, and Sam Slick and several other individuals working with him decided, hey, we could kind of create an archive of the sort of visual around politics in Latin America. So in some cases, that's absolutely true. In other cases, like these Medeiros pieces here that are depicting Vietnam, and the pieces on that back wall that are sort of depicting the revolution in Cuba, these are more, they're very well-known works of art from a Cuban artist, so they've been exhibited everywhere, but they were originally printed in smaller runs. Other materials, like a lot of those that you are going to see here, and some of the other spaces would have been sort of larger runs. Okay, Suzanne, thank you for that question. The online stuff is more likely that than the stuff that you see in the walls here.
I'll just share with you an impression when I brought my graphic design 2 class up here. We talked about the pop art influence and how that is really interesting, because in America and England, we associate pop art with consumerism, and here the pop art style is being used for kind of communist, socialist. Yeah. So we found that interesting.
Great. Okay. How many of you have already worked with this in the pop art context? Students. Come on. Okay, so that was actually one of the things that I had prepared to discuss with you. Was one of the artists that is represented here in a few pieces. You see them over here dealing with agrarian reform in Peru, And you see it over here in the soda can made in the USA with the Puerto Rican flag. Jesus Ruiz Durand is well recognized among artists in Latin America and in other parts of the world as a pop artist. And he did a special kind of pop art that has been very influential throughout Latin America and other parts of the world, right, where dispossessed peoples are sort of working towards reclaiming their possessions. So it's a pop art of the dispossessed, if you can think of it in that way. And I would invite those of you who have already dealt with that to sort of point out some places where you think that work is influencing other works, maybe that you know from the United States or other artists that you may have some access to in other parts of the world, because that's a pretty important contribution. Thank you. Yeah.
I'm noticing a lot of the colors are a little bit either lighter or faded. I'm wondering if that's like the printing technique or the age or like stylistic choice.
So I would say, and Alan, you might be able to help here too. I would say it's a combination of all of the above, okay? The dates on these posters range from the 1950s through the 2000s. And they do come from areas and from artists who are working oftentimes with limited resource. So that could have a lot to do with the color. They are kept at the University of New Mexico. I wish we had better preservation of these materials. In a lot of cases, they are just sort of stacked one on top of the other. You'll notice as you go through the materials that are on the walls are the actual posters, and I'm not super encouraging of touching too much, but you'll notice there's a vast differentiation in terms of the paper. In some cases, you're dealing with very thin newsprint, right? So a lot of these are really thin newsprint. The materials here on the table are copies of materials that were so thin, right? Almost like tissue paper, that we couldn't permit Professor Stokes to bring them here. So you have some copies. So that's sort of working with limited resource, right? A lot of our art historians at UNM say it's sort of a rascuache, working with what you have, mentality or method. So yeah, I think there's a combination of fading over time. Obviously, these Maderos pieces that are done in the 1960s and then reprinted later in the 1990s are more colorful than some of the others, and I think that is sort of very characteristic of the artist. Did I answer you? Okay. Other comments or questions? Like I said, I think conversations are important. If I just throw stuff at you, you'll go, oh.
I was just going to add on to what you were talking about, pop art, that it was all part of what they called comunicación popular, that they, in addition to doing posters, did comic books and other kinds of printed materials that they felt that were going to be attractive to people to read in order to communicate certain social issues and positions.
Thanks for that. Thanks for that. Yeah, I think, so how many of you are Spanish speakers? Okay, so comunicación popular is kind of a tricky term, right? Because if we were, speakers of English might look at that and say popular communication. But popular is a loaded term, right, throughout Latin America. And it oftentimes means of the people, sort of in a group. And a lot of these artists work in groups that are called collectives. And the idea behind a collective is in part that conversation with lots of people from lots of places with different perspectives are really challenging the sort of simple mentality, right, that might create a piece of art. But it's also about resources, going back to that question of resources. If you can pool resources together, right, and make those resources available to the collective, you can accomplish a lot more as a group. And then there is that piece where they are sort of speaking with and speaking through and speaking to the population as a whole, right? So I was going to say at one point there's lots of different kinds of iconography that you guys see represented here that is very specific to historical periods, very specific to places, very specific to histories. And one of those pieces of iconography is sort of the person of the land, right? Or the person who is fighting in the interests of the people as a group. You see it a lot with this sort of, I know you guys have this image here. You see it a lot in that sort of symbolism of the sort of lifted fist. And that same mentality and that pop art really influences, on the back wall there, the work of the Asaro movement in Oaxaca, which is working today, who were sort of working in concert with lots of different political collectives dealing with students' rights, dealing with teachers' rights, dealing with women's rights, dealing with indigenous people's rights, and sort of working with different groups of those peoples in order to speak to the local Mexican government in Oaxaca, but also to the national Mexican government as well. So that concept of the people working sort of in concert with one another popularly and sort of in ways that everyone can access is a really important piece of the big picture behind a lot of these works.
I explain my students because I am Cuban and I grew up inside all this propaganda. I like really what they show here because at that time I remember that they took the best artists to do these posters, and also the majority was about politics, about propaganda, but some of them is about art.
Right.
For example, like in cine, they have beautiful posters, and also like one that is there that says "Save the World," that is for scenes that they told to the population. So the poster in Cuba was, when I entered the first time here, I was like so familiar for me because every day you see, you go for the street and you see many of these things. But the position here have a priority that cover more or less the majority of the topics that they show there.
Yeah.
So I explain this to my students because they are very young and they don't know this time. So it was beautiful that you bring this here.
Well, I'm really excited that they're here, and I'm sure when you went around the room, you noticed the sort of prevalence of Cuba in this space and of artists from Cuba. So this is probably a nice opportunity for me to highlight some of the works that are from Cuba and to talk a little bit about those artists that are from Cuba, and maybe also to talk about why Cuba might be prevalent in this particular show. But it's also really prevalent in the works that we have available for people to utilize at the University of New Mexico, and there are really good reasons for that, and there are probably important reasons to talk about with you all. So you're going to notice sort of over on this wall, you're seeing various references to Cuba in the context of the Cuban flag, in the context of a place in Cuba, Giron. You're seeing in that particular reference an indication of the United States with the stars and stripes. And that connection between the United States and Cuba is a really fascinating connection, right? That is explored kind of throughout the history texts that deal with the Cuban Revolution, and also with the popularity of one of those iconic figures that you see all over the room, and that's Fidel Castro. Does everybody know? Does everybody in this room know who Fidel Castro is? Did you recognize his image before somebody told you who he was. How many of you knew that was Fidel Castro before anybody said anything? Okay. So iconic for some, but not necessarily for others. So that's always interesting for me. I teach history and I teach literature and Latin American studies, and I'm always interested to see these iconic figures that I grew up studying and knowing are not necessarily iconic to everyone else. I realized that when the first history class I taught, I thought Emiliano Zapata was known to everyone because I came from New Mexico, and in New Mexico, Emiliano Zapata is one of those representatives of the people, right? And I went to Virginia, and the students looked at me like I was crazy to think anybody would ever know of a guy named Emiliano Zapata. We don't see him here, by the way. So these materials are really sort of addressing Cuba and the relationship of Cuba to the United States, and you'll also notice to Vietnam, and that's a really important piece that carries over into the next grouping of images, which are also Cuban, and the artist is René Medeiros Passos. You see his work here, and you see his work over there. And there's an interesting story behind these Vietnamese pieces. So in these days, we like to talk about embedded journalists, right? And Medeiros was actually an embedded artist in residence. So the Cuban government wanted to be involved in reform and revolution in other parts of the world. Vietnam was one of those parts of the world. South Africa and other parts of Africa, Angola, were other parts of the world that Cuba was involved in. So Medeiros was actually sent as an artist in residence to sort of walk and travel and fight alongside revolutionaries in Vietnam. And these pieces were sort of commissioned by the government in that context. Yeah. What was his name again? René, R-E-N-E. Medeiros, M-E-D-E-R-O-S. Passos, P-A-Z-O-S. Is that right? Those of you who know? Did I get it right? Okay. I'm not working with my notes at this point. So it's important to sort of make those connections. So when we're talking, and I tend, as a person who teaches Latin America, to focus on Latin America and to sometimes forget about the sort of networks that take Latin America into other parts of the world. And that's a really interesting context. Or we focus on the relationship between the United States and Latin America, because all of us who study Latin American studies and who teach Latin American studies are actually doing it because somebody in the US government thought it was important for people to study Latin America. It's important to recognize that too. So, and then if you guys want to sort of turn your attention from these materials to the materials on that back wall, you're going to see another reflection, right? Several reflections that are numbered and sequenced to address different stages of the revolution in Cuba. Anybody notice anything that stands out to them in that regard? And that compares with these pieces over here. They're talking to each other.
Is it the same artist?
It's the same artist, exact same artist.
I noticed some of the figures have blue skin.
I'm sorry?
I noticed some of the figures have blue skin.
Blue skin, okay.
Like the warmth of the orange.
Uh-huh.
I guess relates to people being like familiar in like warmer presences, but the blue is more.
Okay, great.
There are multiple
I don't know.
figures
That's
as well.
yeah.
Makes it.
I'm sorry?
There are multiple figures in those, as opposed to a single iconic.
Sure. Yes, multiple figures. So again, sort of dealing with that notion of peoples, right? Peoples sort of working in concert together. That is an important concept. And you see that in both cases, in the Cuban case and in the Vietnamese case. Other things you guys notice? And I like the association of the colors with different contexts, and I don't know. So that's one of the places where my point of departure comes out of history and literature and librarianship, right? So I'm not an art historian, although I work with a lot of materials that art historians access. I couldn't tell you. some of those relationships, but I think it's important to talk about them as a group.
Well, the transition's really good if you look at them going across, because you get a really good idea of the different moves that you're going for with the color and the uses. When you actually see what looks like a skirmish, there's very hot colors, it's very vibrant. And then when you come to sort of the aftermath, it's very dull and dead. It's very black with the bodies all highlighted in red. It really gets the mood across very, very well.
Great. They kind of look like newspaper clippings. Like newspaper clippings? Interesting.
Because of the way that it's framed with the light, and then it has the text on top instead of inside the actual image.
Okay.
Kind of reminds me of like a newspaper with the little blurb saying this is what's in the photo.
Okay.
They look more narrative, whereas these look more descriptive.
Yeah. Okay.
Seems like a story's being told.
Okay. Yeah, so these are sequenced, and as far as I know, these aren't necessarily sequenced, or they're not presented with titles and in a sequence. Alan?
I was just going to point out that almost all of these were originally done as silk screens. They're beautiful, hand-cut, works of art. They're amazing, amazing pieces, and the detail in them is inspiring.
I was going to say that soup can reminds me of Andy Warhol's Campbell's soup. The commercial and that repetition of the strip lines and colors.
And for the most part, they're all vertical, but those are horizontal in orientation. That sort of introduces a horizon line and invites us in a little bit more.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I learned, I get things that I don't otherwise get. That's great. Let me point out that Medeiros is probably one of the best known artists that you see reflected in this exhibit. And that gets to the question of the predominance of Cuba. And it comes in a couple of different ways. So when something becomes well known, or when something is legitimated, it tends to get more attention, right? And from the perspective of a scholar, it gets more attention in scholarship. From the perspective of a government that is funding the arts, and I want to make that clear. A lot of people will talk about these Cuban materials as, propaganda. But in these particular pieces, you are sort of dealing very specifically with art, right? Is it art with some sort of purpose? If I'm embedding an artist in a particular movement, I'm asking the artist to come back with an artistic portrayal of that movement. But it is art, right? And Cuba is probably recognized above most other Latin American countries for their graphic art, precisely because the Cuban government, in the context of the revolution, decided to support the arts and to utilize the arts for revolutionary purposes. So you see a lot of Cuban art in this exhibit because there is a lot of Cuban poster art. They sort of stand out as the country in Latin America that really adopted poster arts and really made poster arts important to the society, right, in Cuba at the time. So that's a reason that you do see so many references to Cuba, even in cases that aren't Cuban. I want to point that out, right? And that comes from both sides. So over in the corner, you see a black poster for a documentary film called Niños Desaparecidos, Disappeared Children, that is really addressing the dirty war, which is happening all over South America and Central America. But in that particular reference, we're focusing on Chile. And that Niños Desaparecidos is a film poster of a film done in Cuba about Chile. And the poster is from Cuba as well. And then you have the other side of that, where individuals or artists from other countries are addressing either the Cuban Revolution or Cuban arts or figures that were made popular by Cuba. So I'm going to point out that Vive Che. That's another iconic figure right? Che Guevara. How many of you knew who that was before you came in here? Okay, so not as many as I might expect. So, how many of you have seen the film, The Motorcycle Diaries? Okay, those are the people who knew who that was. So Che Guevara is an Argentine doctor, actually, who was, and I had to say that in the past tense, a friend of Fidel Castro's, who fought alongside Fidel Castro and this other guy, Camilo Cienfuegos, who you see there in the 102 años, and also in that final Mederos piece, sort of up there in a framed image behind Fidel Castro. Camilo is sort of the Cuban who died in the context of that revolution and sort of got held up within Cuba as a particularly important iconic figure. Che Guevara went on. I said that the Cuban government sent Mederos into Vietnam as a sort of embedded painter. Well, Che Guevara was sort of the person who would be the ambassador of revolutionary principles, guerrilla principles, into other parts of the world. So Che went to Africa, several countries in Africa. He went to several other countries in Latin America, and died in one of those countries, Bolivia, and is sort of raised as this sort of outsider part of the Cuban Revolution. At some point, there's lots of in Brazil they would say fofoca around Che and Fidel. Most people suggest that they had a falling out and he was sort of sent off into dangerous places because of that falling out. And that maybe there was some collusion in terms of his death in Bolivia with the Cuban government because he was getting rather popular. And some think that Fidel Castro didn't want to have competition from a Che. So that is actually a that's a Puerto Rican artist sort of depicting that individual there. So now I'm losing my train of thought because I'm going in lots of different places. So, and then getting back to the pop art piece, I think it's important to recognize some of the well-known other artists. So we had one of the students sort of identified Andy Warhol as an influence in the Durand piece here, made in the USA. That sort of question of consumerism is very important. Che is the image of consumerism in the United States and throughout the world, right? That sort of, there's a piece in this book which I'm gifting, and maybe Alan is too, I don't know, by a really well-known comic artist, Chicano comic artist named Lalo. How many of you know of Lalo? That's sort of a contemporary. There's an image of Che with the Nike symbol on his hat, so really dealing with the commodification of Che Guevara and of revolution, right, in some of those materials, which is interesting as well.
Some of the posters for President Obama when he was running for his first, the Hope posters, with a direct reference to this image.
Yeah, absolutely. To the Che image.
To that image,
image, yes.
yes.
Can I ask who did the Nixon around the corner? There's a very interesting Nixon around the corner. Evil Nixon with dead bodies on his brain.
In the collectives. Right. You know what? I didn't. Oh, that is. I remember now. It's Luis Beltran. That image is Luis Beltran, and Beltran. And that piece is actually addressed in the book, the Latin American posters book that we're going to leave here on the table. So you'll get some additional information from it. And it's important to kind of dealing with that notion of collective. This OCLAE collective is an international collective working out of Cuba of students, right? So it's recognized as a collective of artists coming from all of Latin America and the Caribbean that are sort of students, addressing students' rights. So, and that piece has me thinking of sort of famous and infamous figures, right? So Richard Nixon is Wow, what an image. But even more disturbing in that image is the image of destruction. And I think that is a reference to Cambodia.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Death on his mind.
Yeah. So, and you see that in that particular rendition in a couple of different places. So you see it here. You see it in this Place Vietnam, which is a Mexican piece, if I remember correctly, from the Socialist Party of Mexico. You see it in some of the images of nuclear war and of South Africa as well. So that's another sort of piece of this iconography, is not just sort of struggle and reform and revolution, but complete destruction, right? And complete destruction sort of wrought by nuclear weapons, right? Or by imperial interests in different parts of Latin America.
Did you say Beltran?
Beltran, B-E-L-T-R-A-N. Thanks for that question. It's good to sort of force me to go back in my head. And
Corner from a lot of this, and
yeah.
What's the significance of the conio piece?
Oh, this piece right here?
Yeah.
You can talk about that, I bet.
Well, I was sort of surprised to see this in juxtaposition to these other images, but yeah, this is from Puerto Rico, and it's the word coño is a very, very strong expletive that probably a sort of watered down version would just be damn it or something like that. But anyway, I think it's just sort of protesting against everything. And
you can see that in the script.
All of the stuff that's here, yeah, right.
there's handwriting all throughout the letter.
Yeah.
And it's
And a dollar sign.
And it's good to point out that this collective, right, this collective, Alacran, is a collective that Alan worked with.
I did.
And this particular artist here, Martorell, is one of the artists that's really influential within that collective. And these pieces are coming at you from Puerto Rico. So we talked a lot about materials coming out of Cuba, but there's a lot of material in this exhibit and a lot of material in our collection also from Puerto Rico. So that sort of Caribbean connection is very strong in the context of this work. And I'm interested in this artist for several reasons, because I work with artist books as well. I don't know if you guys have any classes that deal with the book sort of as a work of art, but Martorell has several pieces that we recently purchased that are sort of in the portfolio / artist book format. And there's another connection here. We talk about a connection with different countries in Africa and a connection with connections with Cambodia and Vietnam. But in this particular image, there is a connection with Algeria, right, and with the Middle East. And that connection, well, I like the way these are talking to one another because that connection is important in the contemporary Mexican context, where talking about walls, right, is important in Mexico, and comparing the walls between the United States and Mexico and the walls between Palestine and Israel is a very sort of prevalent trope in contemporary Mexican stuff. So this artist collective, and you can see they're dealing with that relationship between kind of Mexico and its neighbor with the barbed wire, but Mexico is Mexico, right? The gun that is pointing at Mexico is Mexico itself, which is a really interesting critique. At any rate, you're not seeing it in this selection, but they deal quite a bit with Palestine in their work as well.
This one, to me, shows the influence of the posters from the Haight-Ashbury. See this, 59?
Uh-huh.
This was specifically for a poster for the showing of the film, The Battle of Algiers.
Right.
And so, that's again like the importance of the popular culture that, they took into account all the different media that were influential.
I'm sure there is that connection. Those are the interesting kind of pieces, I think, too.
I went to the left right there. What is the meaning of the swastika under the flag?
Right here, the swastika. Oh boy. Oh boy. The swastika is loaded international symbolism, and oftentimes it's used in Latin American works to identify fascism in general. And I guess we could say a lot more, but I'm just going to stop at that is sort of representative of fascism. I'm not going to talk about the fascists that are getting identified there.
That's a commentary on a certain party within a certain country right there?
I'm sorry?
That's like a commentary about a party within a certain country?
So this one, again, sort of dealing with that idea of students and student collectives and sort of people organizing as groups. This is Save the Life of the Students and the Young Chilenos who are sequestered or captured by the junta. So this is dealing very specifically with political prisoners. I said really briefly a few things about, so there are lots of wars that are represented here. We've done a fair share with the war in Vietnam and with the revolution in Cuba. And I said something about the dirty war in much of Central America, dirty wars in much of Central America and South America. So the dirty war is one of these sort of wars by proxy where different governments in Latin America, with the support of governments from outside of Latin America, the United States, a major force within that context, are battling what they feel are sort of dangerous individuals and dangerous groups for the future of their country. And what happened in Chile is fairly well documented now as a result of several truth commissions. What happened in Argentina, also getting well documented as a result of truth commissions. What happened in Peru, also being fairly well documented, is that very right-wing governments in those countries took people who engaged in thoughts or conversations that were leftist in nature, took them into custody, questioned the people around them about their interaction with communist or socialist ideals. In a lot of cases, disappeared those individuals, and by disappeared, I generally mean killed those individuals. There are several known cases in Argentina and Chile of people just being dumped into the ocean. So that's what that is. And I get very emotional when I talk about that because I have several friends whose parents or aunts and uncles disappeared in that context. So that's something that people still live, I guess, in a lot of Latin America. And it's a war that is different from the revolution in Cuba or different from the war in Vietnam because until very recently, the 1990s and the 2000s, wasn't legitimated by international governments or local governments as something that actually happened. So people knew that their family members or that their friends or their professors or work colleagues were disappearing, but there was no effort really made to talk about what happened to them. So there's this sort of undercurrent of, were they gone? And if they are gone and I'm guilty by association, how am I supposed to behave?
That kind of leads into something I wanted to ask. Do we know that if any of these artists ever experienced any violence for the images that they're showing? Obviously, apparently they faced it, if that's the case.
I don't know. I don't know that I could answer that question. One thing that I can say is that being legitimated internationally as an artist is a form of protection.
Gotcha.
So if you are recognized as an important artist and you are exhibited in other parts of the world, then there's some attention to you as an individual that shouldn't be disappeared. Right. And so my training is in Brazil, so I'm a Brazilianist, and you don't have any Brazilian pieces here, but I can sort of pull in a reference from Brazil. The same dirty war happened in Brazil. It isn't as well documented, and largely because of the way they organized it in Brazil as it is in other parts of South America. But a lot of singers and musicians decided to take the opportunity of sort of these sort of grand stages in order to make themselves very popular, not only internationally but in Brazil, by performing double entendre that the military government would think was, praise for the military governments on one hand, but that had this sort of undercurrent. And I think it's interesting to pull that in with coño here, because unless you know coño, you're not necessarily paying attention to that as a full word. You know what I mean? You're seeing no, and you're trying to make the connection with the C and the other O. So those artists really took advantage of the opportunity to say, it looks like this, right? But that's not what it is. And find protection in that context. And we have, I do want to point out another artist who's sort of pretty much contemporary artist from Mexico, Raúl Castro, who has done this Virgin piece and that 1492, America 1992. He's an artist that is compared with René Magritte because of that kind of surreal, what you're seeing is not what is, right, idea. So you can kind of see that in the representation of an iconic figure, the Virgin, sort of flirting, right? And you can see that in this kind of very in-your-face iconic representation of indigenous peoples in the Americas, sort of flipping the bird at America. So, I sort of went around that question, but I'm sure there are artists who may or may not be reflected in the collection, in these collections, who have been targeted. I know more about this artist collective here, and they are definitely targets of the government. And those who have made names for themselves, the artist who did this piece, some of them often don't sign because they sign as collective, precisely for that reason. Because if they sign as a collective group, they're not being identified as individuals, and they can't be pursued as individuals. And it's harder to pursue a group than it is to pursue the individual. That artist has actually traveled all over the world and is getting fairly well known, and sometimes he does sign his materials, again, because now that he's popular, people are paying attention to him. And if he disappears, it's an enormous news story. Those are great questions. We're getting, I think, oh my gosh. You see what happens when you're having a good conversation? An hour goes by really quickly. Do we have other questions?
Yeah. I would really like this series of revolution series here. Can you tell me what the original display or context for that piece was? Like how it was originally displayed?
So, let me see what I can remember. I don't know how it would have been originally displayed in Cuba. I know that it was commissioned at the 10-year anniversary of the revolution to sort of commemorate the revolution, and you can see that it's sort of marking very specific places or points of departure in the development of the revolution. So in 1959, the liberation of the people of Cuba from the sort of economic imperialism on the island at that time. And then 1960, the sort of nationalization. By nationalization, I mean sort of taking taking properties, taking monies that were invested sort of externally to other peoples, to other corporations, to other places, and sort of making them the sort of focus of Cuba. And there were lots of things that were done in that context. Addressing the arts as a place where the revolution would sort of take place is part of that. And then the victory of Giron, that was a direct attack, right, from the United States onto Cuba. The crisis of October, I wish that I could tell you what that is, but I'm not so sure. now I'm getting lost in years. And I'm also having a hard time seeing. Anybody want to jump in?
I think the October incident, I looked it up when I was trying to translate some of this. It was talking about police shootings from civilians, if I understand.
Oh, interesting. Huh.
Yeah, I looked into that.
Okay.
I looked up a couple of these, but I think that's what that one was. I'm not 100% sure a while ago. Yeah, there was some sort of like rebellion, obviously, it was during that time, and there were some civilians that were shot down by the Cuban police.
Okay. So, okay, that's great. And then we get into sort of different organizations, sort of working towards the interests of the state. And most of those kind of leading up to 1967. And then, you know, the sort of, I don't know, iconicization of a hero past, and then, I guess, los 10 millones van, and then starting Mario followed it. So I guess just sort of identified as sort of 10 years of revolution and points of departure within it. And I don't know where they put it, to be honest.
They're kind of small, and I could see these as like huge, like down some big boulevard or across some big building, or I don't know.
And they may have been. I know in a lot of these cases, what you're seeing in the production here is not necessarily what you see sort of on the street.
Yeah.
So in some of these cases, they would have been plastered as big wheat pastes. I don't know if that's the case with that one. But definitely, you know, what you see here is a representation of what may have happened on the street. And that gives me a great opportunity. Do I have time, or should I stop?
I think maybe just a few more minutes, and
Okay.
then probably some of these classes have to get back.
Just a quick word about the Slit collection. The majority of these come from a collection called the Slit collection. It's a really interesting collection in terms of conversation, but also in terms of being a sort of working in archives. And I don't know how many of you are going to work in archives, and I don't want to bore you with archives, but Sam Slick was a Spanish professor who started collecting materials, right, from different political movements in Latin America so he could share them with his students and maybe teach them vocabulary at the same time that they're dealing with sort of cultural contexts in Latin America. And as he did that, he started making connections with other professors and several students and saying, hey, if you're going off to a Spanish-speaking part of the world and later also a Portuguese-speaking part of the world, why don't you bring back some poster, right? Because I have this collection of posters that are offering people cultural context. And he amassed this collection, probably about 10,000 posters, right, from working with other people who were going to different places where they spoke Spanish and picking up posters. So it's a really interesting sort of cultural portrayal because it depicts such different interests, right? So somebody who's really sort of in a Spanish-speaking country at a time where an election is taking place and has some vested interest in a particular individual might grab a political poster. Somebody who is interested in pop art might grab a pop art poster. Somebody who's really interested in agrarian reform or in workers' movements might pick up sort of the workers' context. So you get a real good sort of gamut of representation in that collection. It's frustrating for me as an archivist because people made decisions before I got there to add materials that were like in nature, but not necessarily part of the Slit collection. Alan Oliver's materials are an example of that into the Slit collection. So when I go back and work with students, you know, I'm saying, oh, this is a really great collection, and it kind of works between the late 1950s and early 1990s, and then in pop these materials that are from the later 1990s or that are from an area that wasn't represented, and I don't have all of the information about who gave us those materials. That makes it hard, but this stuff helps people identify UNM with Latin American posters, and I always get calls, hey, I'm cleaning out my garage, I have a bunch of Nicaraguan posters, are you interested? So it's a really great opportunity to sort of see other materials too. And we're not adding those to the SLIC collection anymore. We have another collection where we identify the people that these are coming from, so people can make those connections. We didn't talk about female artists. I do want to note that over here, this is a Cuban artist also. Daisy, help me. I have to look her up. Poster arts in Latin America are not super kind to women. It is important to note that. This is Daisy Garcia Lopez, all 4 of those pieces. She is a fairly well recognized Cuban poster artist who is exhibited all over the world, but there's not a whole lot written about her. So if there's anybody out here who's interested in female artists that would like to talk about a female artist that people haven't talked about, she's your woman. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your questions, conversations.
Actually, I just wanted a quick translation on what that one